I have basically made my career as I think it fair to say, founding figure in queer art history. When I started out as an art historian, no one was taking sexuality seriously, and I found that very troubling. And so I began working in queer studies in 1989, and first ran what was the first queer studies program in the United States at City College of San Francisco, and then ultimately moved to Yale University, where I started the queer studies program at Yale, and then now at the University of Pennsylvania, where I'm also doing, what is a queer art history PhD program.
Okay.
And I should say that I come from uh, political activism. I started out as a street activist and eventually decided to bring my academic interests and my political interests together. But I was probably 40 before my arrest record was shorter than my publication record. Well, I think the most important changes are two. The first one was that before the term homosexual arose, there were wider possibilities for both same-sex and different-sex interactions among people. In fact, I have talked to a contemporary artist who recently passed away, but was in his late 80s, and he told me that the worst thing that happened to him was the advent of liberation. Because before liberation, he said, you could have sex with anybody. It didn't make you anything, and it didn't make them anything. So there was no language associated with the sexual act. And he said, as a consequence, I was sleeping with straight boys all the time. But when that became homosexual, right, then all of a sudden, the pool of possible sexual partners, he said, radically, right, contracted. I think the way to think about this is to say that it was a liberation in Europe
Mhm.
and an oppression most every place else. Um, a liberation because in Europe, it finally had a name, it had a kind of political and social impact. Uh, but even in Europe, like for example, the Prussians were profoundly homophobic, but in southern Germany, homosexuality was completely legal. And of course, France had in 1804, under the Napoleonic Code, gotten rid of. Now, the French are very clever about this, and what they did was they made homosexuality legal, but policed and criminalized homosexual contact in public. So if you couldn't meet one another, then how could you be homosexual, right? That then becomes the problem. But I guess my broader point is this, that history doesn't move in one direction. Um, and what was liberatory for a number of Europeans became oppressive to a number of people in other parts of the world. Because most of the world didn't have a problem with homosexuality. Most of the world understood sexuality in the way that we now understand taste in food.
Mhm.
And the fact that you like broccoli or you don't like broccoli is not a fundamental categorical distinction among people because it doesn't carry any meanings. And
Mhm.
that's the way sexuality was understood in Japan and China and a number of other places. But when the Europeans came, all of a sudden sexuality became a defining interior quality of people. And it was no longer a behavior, it was an essence. The image of the homosexual went through essentially two distinct phases. The first part, which is to say, from basically the coinage of the term in 1869 through the end of the 19th century, was predominantly image of basically adolescents, boys, often so sexualized that they make contemporary viewers uncomfortable. Something important happened around 1905. And what happened is that all of a sudden, the very artists who had been doing eroticized adolescents started doing bodybuilders. The same figures. So much so that Sasha Schneider, one of those artists who had been doing boys exclusively, even turned his artistic studio into a bodybuilding studio and advertised that he would make your body as beautiful as the male bodies in his paintings. And what that caused me to think about the relationship between language and image. And what I realized was that as long as the dominant definition of homosexuality in the 19th century was the earlier definition of sexuality, which the term was Uranian, and it basically said that homosexuals are a third sex, neither male nor female. Well, how do you represent a third sex if the body is male? The way you do it is through representing an adolescent, because the adolescent is, if you will, incompletely gendered. The adolescent retains aspects of, as it were, female body, even in male embodiment. But then, when the term homosexual shifted to talking about people of the same sex, then normative gender presentation becomes, right, the predominant mode, and who's more normative than a bodybuilder? So we see this abrupt shift from boys to men, and it's following shifts in understanding language. There is no pre-existing desire. Desire is always premised on the language and the understandings we use to define an identity. So there's a work in the exhibition called The Secret. And it's a image of two women plaster talking to one another, one speaking in the other one's ear. And it operates on two levels because the artist is actually representing her lover. And so there are two secrets at work. There's the literal telling of a secret, but there's also the secret that the other woman is, in fact, her lover. And a lot of the works that we encounter, and this is the thing that makes art history, I would argue, the largest archive of the history of sexuality that we have in the world, because representation allows images to speak out of both sides of the mouth. To one audience, you may only see one thing, but to somebody who's clued in and understands the codes, you get another significance. And the great thing about art is that it doesn't force you into one reading or the other, and so you're allowed to take whatever you want away from it. I want people to understand that there's nothing natural about sexuality, that sexuality is always cultural. And that one of the great lies we tell ourselves is that we're acting out of our nature when in fact what we're enacting are cultural scripts. Um, I'm I'm in the paradoxical position of being a queer studies scholar who wishes for the destruction of my field. Because when finally we don't have to talk about in specific terms, right, the history of gay and lesbian or whatever term we're now using, but rather it becomes integrated into history, then I'll be out of a job and I'll be very happy to be out of a job. The only reason I'm talking about queerness is because no one else is, right? And because so many people have been robbed of a complicated understanding of sexuality by dominant culture, which has continuously lied about same-sex desire. Once same-sex desire returns to its historical position as part and parcel of human sexuality, just like different sex desire, then we will have achieved what I think of as nirvana, right? The possibility of sexuality that doesn't require you to adopt a label or embrace one or another identity. And then everybody will be free. And that's